Hello and welcome to Spirit Pig. Inspired by the mission 7 billion fulfilled people, I track down the greatest thought leaders on the planet and interview them about happiness and fulfillment. Today I'm speaking with Lynne McTaggart. Lynne is an award-winning journalist and the author of 7 books, including her latest book, The Power of 8, and 3 worldwide bestsellers, The Fjord, The Intention Experiment, The Bond, which are all considered seminal books on the new science and are now translated into 30 languages. She is consistently voted one of the world's top 100 spiritual leaders for her groundbreaking work with consciousness and the power of intention. Lynne has been a featured speaker in a host of movies, including What the Bleep, The Living Matrix, I Am, and The Abundance Factor. She is also the co-founder and editor of the world's #1 health magazine, What Doctors Don't Tell You, which is published in 14 countries worldwide, I believe. Lynne, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's great to be with you, Duncan.
I was looking up some of your titles or what you've been referred to as over the years, and I think some of them were metaphysical rock star, the Madonna of the quantum world, but my personal favourite title was the Dalai Lama. That's #1 in my book.
That is mine too, and it was given to me by Tom Shadyac, who did the movie I Am. He did an intro for me one time in a talk I gave, and because he was showing his movie then, and referred to me as that, which was really darling.
If someone says the phrase "we're all connected, we're all one," I'm sure there's some people whose eyes are going to roll back, in the back of their head and think, oh God, here we go. But there's actually so much science behind this. Could you maybe describe this idea of we're all connected, we're all one in relation to biology and in particular mirror neurons?
Sure. I mean, I'd like to address it in a couple of ways.
Yeah.
First of all, I just want to put on the table that what I really hate is unsupported woo-woo. I really do. I mean, I have a background as an investigative reporter. That's where I came from and started out my life. So that kind of desire to have evidence for things has never left me. When we talk about we're all one, on a quantum level, we are all one because we have, on our nethermost level, we are made up of subatomic particles. And subatomic particles aren't little individual entities like a billiard ball, as they're described in high school physics. They are vibrating packets of energy that trade energy with other vibrating packets of energy all the time, like an endless game of tennis. So if you factor on all of those little tennis games going on, there is an unbelievable, unfathomable amount of energy being traded in empty space. And there's a couple of implications here. First of all, that creates a giant energy field that has been called the field in my book, the 0-point field. But there's 2 very interesting things about subatomic particles. Number 1, they have an infinite capacity for information. And number 2, they go on forever. And so if you think of this mothership of quantum field that's sitting out there in empty space, like some supercharged backdrop, it's a memory bank for everything that ever was, and we are part of that. So we essentially have access to everything in the planet and each other. So we are literally all connected on our quantum level. And secondly, on the connection between people, scientists have discovered that we're a lot less individual than we think we are. There are neurons in our head that when we see someone else perform an action or have an emotion, the very same neurons in us fire as if we were having that emotion, we were performing that action. So we've been designed to have this so that we can empathize with other people. But what that essentially means is that our brains, our minds, what we're dealing with all the time is a complex mix of our own thoughts and everybody else's thoughts. We also know from the other biology that we look at, the biology of epigenetics, that we aren't built from inside out. We're built from outside in. We are built from environmental influences. Bruce Lipton talks about this hugely. The quartet of atoms that sit above the gene, they determine, genes are like the keys of a piano. They sit silently and wait to be played. And what plays them is that epigenome, that quartet of atoms that sit above the genes that are hugely affected by our environment. the water we drink, the food we eat, the friends we have, the sum total of how we live our lives, that determines whether those genes are going to be played, those keys are going to be played. So again, we are built, we have a bond between ourselves and the environment that is, impossible to break. That determines who we are. That builds us from outside in. So all of these things demonstrate that it's pretty hard to say, this is us. This is where we end, and that's where the rest of the world begins.
When you were speaking to quantum physicists, because you came from a journalist background and maybe science wasn't your thing, it was very much using metaphors and pictures to try and break down this science that is maths and physics, and it blows your head, into actually pictures. And one thing which described that well, which blew my head, was, say you're having a conversation with somebody and we're sitting whatever, a couple of feet away from each other. There's more energy just in that empty space between us to boil all the water in the ocean or something. Was that it?
Yeah, all the oceans in the world.
I mean, that's just blows my head. I mean, it's because we believe this is just empty space and it's nothing. And if you accept that, then it just makes you think what we've just got no idea what's going on, do we? And I find that quite an exciting thought, as opposed to.
Well, I think it is exciting because the science that we've been given, the science we've been told, is a very bleak view of the world. Mm. It's the idea of, the Darwinian view of eat or be eaten. You've got to get to the finish line before someone else gets there first. Zero-sum game. And the other idea that we are, this individual, this lonely thing on a lonely planet in a lonely universe, that we are so isolated and individual. And that's the antithesis of my work. All of my work is all about the fact that we are connected, that we thrive when we use that connection, whether it's in large groups or small, and that, we need it. We need it. And we need to be part of something bigger. In fact, we thrive when we get off of ourselves and think about somebody else.
There's a famous study from the 1950s called the Vulvas Cave experiment. Could you describe that to anyone who's not familiar with it?
Yeah, I love this experiment. It's one of the most beloved psychological experiments of all time. It really illustrates the power of going after a larger goal. Mustafa Sherif, who is the godfather of social science, social psychology, put together an experiment where he got a batch of 12-year-old boys, put them in 2 buses and sent them down to summer camp. And they never set eyes on the other group, but they were told to devise their own names, their own identities, their own flags, and they were put in separate housing. And the first time they met each other, they were engaged in highly competitive games. And watching from the sidelines were a bunch of camp counselors who were actually social psychologists in disguise. Now, after a while, they didn't have to stoke the competition because the kids were killing each other. They were ripping up each other's flags. They were beating each other. They were stealing each other's prize money. They hated each other. They hated each other. And no amount of, jolly getting to know you type events in the evening could overcome that. So then the psychologists decided to devise a bunch of crises in the camp. So they put an impediment in the water supply, and the boys had to work together to get it out. And they put a truck in the ditch. Boys had to work together to get it out. And lo and behold, after a while, they noticed something miraculous happening. The boys were sitting and eating together. They were starting to befriend each other. And ultimately, they unanimously voted to ride on the same single bus on the way home. And one of the heads of one of the groups spent all of his prize money to buy ice cream for the whole lot. It's amazing, and it's called a superordinate goal. It's so powerful because it's been demonstrated over and over again, the power of everyone coming together to do something collectively that cannot be achieved by individuals alone. And how that breaks down separation, that breaks down animosity. It's why oftentimes people unite over a war. But there are other ways, non-violent ways, to come together as well. But it's just one of those demonstrations of the power of the collective.
Do you feel that just our societies and systems are set up in a way that just make conflict inevitable?
Oh, totally. I mean, not every society is this violent or aggressive or zero-sum game. I mean, and I think that one of the big culpable agents here is science. Everybody has to understand that a science is not a finite truth. It's just a story. It tells us who we are and how we're supposed to live. And every so often, a new chapter is written that invalidates everything else that came before. And the story that we're going on, the chapter we're still on, is a story that really came from the 1700s, from Isaac Newton, that described this very well behaved universe of separate objects that were very well behaved and operated according to fixed laws in time and space. And then the other part that augmented this very lonely, individualistic view of isolated things operating according to these fixed laws, but operating individually, was the Darwinian view of, that life's pretty rough and, you've got to get there first. You damn well better get there first. And so that has been translated really since the industrial age into our businesses, into our way of life. It's been embraced by the West, and it really accounts for so much of the problems that we have, because it is the eat or be eaten mentality. And it is, I wrote about this a great deal in The Bond, and it really prompted my work in my new book, The Power of Eight, to look for the healing power of small groups. And, what I discovered almost accidentally was that small groups have an enormous rebound effect. Intending, not individualistically, but in a small group, has an extraordinary rebound effect and can be amazingly healing, not just for the recipient, but also for everyone else involved. And that accidental discovery makes me believe, and more as I work with group intention, makes me believe we were never meant to be alone. Unlike a lot of people in this field who are either scientists or they come from a very new age perspective, my perspective was, I started out my career hunting down baby sellers with hidden microphones and things. I was going to put bad guys in jail. That was my work. And so that kind of skepticism hasn't ever left. So when I heard about the power of intention, and also when I was interviewing scientists for the field, there was a lot of information about the idea that thoughts are not just things, but there are things that affect other things. And they have the capacity to change physical matter. And this had been demonstrated in a lot of experiments, but I was curious, like a journalist is, saying, and there was all this stuff about law of attraction and The Secret. And to me, all I did was sort of have some awkward questions here, like, okay, so what are we talking about here? Are we talking about affecting a quantum particle here, or are we talking about curing cancer? And why are we using this to manifest parking spaces when we could be saving the world with it? And also, what happens when lots of people are thinking the same thought at the same time? Does that somehow magnify the effect? So by then I knew a lot of scientists in this area. And I also had loads of readers, my books are read around the world, et cetera. And I thought, well, if I could put them together, I'll have the biggest global laboratory in the world. And I can really test this out. So that's what the intention experiment was meant to be, putting this all to the ultimate test, largely because I was pretty much a 21st century doubting Thomas. I did this, and, the experiments worked. Short answer to that. They worked. I've run 30 of them to date. Everything from making plants grow faster to, changing the pH of water and changing other properties of water, to lowering violence in war-torn area, even helping someone get over post-traumatic stress disorder. And we've run all of these with different scientists, and of the 30, 26 have shown measurable, essentially, positive, significant results. And, put that in perspective. No pharmaceutical drug out there has that kind of consistent track record. So that was cool, but it isn't the point of my story. It's not the point of my book. The point of my book that turned everything on its head was that I started looking at and surveying the participants of these big experiments. And I started putting people into small groups of 8 too. And I found, to my shock, that we were affecting the targets, but the biggest effect was on the participants. They were really transforming. And I documented all of this because, as I say, I was carefully, consistently surveying them. We studied them afterward. We studied them in a variety of ways. And for instance, when they were involved in a big peace experiment, that's when it first came to light. In 2008, we were sending intention for Sri Lanka. And, we had what looks like an effect. There was a lowering of violence. There was a big change in the war. Our timing seemed very pivotal, the 8 days we sent intention. But again, that's not the interesting part of the story. The interesting part, and maybe we didn't do it, maybe we did, maybe it was just coincidence, who knows? It looked very compelling. But the really interesting and undeniable thing that was going on was I surveyed my participants, and there were about 15,000 or so, and thousands of them sent back answers like this. I felt as though I was plugged into a higher network. I was sobbing uncontrollably. I had goosebumps up and down my arms. I'm hugging everybody I come in contact with. I'm in love with strangers. I made up with my sister. That bad relationship I had with my husband is now so improved. I love my boss, even though I hated him before. And, I quit my job and went to work for the Peace Corps, or I decided I had a dead-end job and I have set up my own business now. I mean, unbelievable changes. As I say, I've documented them all. And it was consistently over and over and over again that the senders were having some big transformational experience too. I looked at that because I was trying to figure this out. I mean, and it started because not just with the peace experiment, but I decided to run a workshop in 2008, and I'd never run one before. I'm a journalist. And I thought, well, I suppose it's time for me to run a workshop. So how am I going to do this? How am I going to show people the power of intention? We'd had a couple of good results with our experiments, big experiments. So I thought to myself, I'm kicking it around with my husband, and I said, maybe I'll put them in groups of 8 or so, and I'll have them send a healing intention to a member of the group, and they'll all hold the same intention, blah, blah, blah. And my husband, he's a journalist too, and he's a great headline writer, goes, yeah, power of 8, I like that. So we have our first workshop. I put people in groups. I'm completely making it up as I go along, saying, go into groups, hold hands, hold the same intention statement. I had some things I knew about how to do intention from studying things with intention masters. And I put that together as a simple program in the intention experiment. And it's in the Power of 8 too. I called it Powering Up, and it's about mind focus and things like that. But I didn't really know how to do this in a group or what was important. So I just told them what I thought should work. I put them in groups. I have them all send intention to somebody in the group with a health challenge. I tell them to come back the next day and report on what happened. I figured they were going to come back and say, this was a nice little feel-good exercise, like getting your back rubbed or something like that, or a facial. And that's not what happened. What happened was people lined up, and person after person after person said things like, I have really bad arthritic pain, and it was completely gone. I have had headaches every day of my life, and I don't have one today. My IBS feels like it's cleared up. And on and on and on for over an hour. And we've had that. I was shocked, and I was also a little upset by this because I thought, this isn't what I do. I study intention scientifically. This is not what I do. I'm not a healer. I'm not Eric Pearl. I don't do that. He's a good friend, by the way. I don't do that. So for one thing, it's why it's taken me nearly 10 years to write this in a book, because I was pretty frightened by it. But in every workshop I ran ever since, same thing. I was just at the Mile High Church in Denver a couple of days ago, and I was running these groups, and we had extraordinary results. We had a woman with a stroke who was post-stroke. She couldn't focus her eyes. And after the healing intention for her, Her eyes were focusing normally. We had, an accident victim couldn't lift her arm. It was absolutely frozen shoulder, etc. Felt normal afterward. I've had people with scoliosis write me afterward to say that they've had to change the rear view mirror in their car because their back's so much straighter, or somebody, whose arm was totally immobile, who was moving it normally. A woman with MS showed up the next day without her crutches, not cured, but much better. Woman with cataracts said she was 80% better. I mean, unbelievable, unbelievable stuff. And the power of 8 is really trying to understand it from every angle, from brain science to altruism. So that's to have a long-winded answer to your question. I've looked at the science of altruism, and altruism is like a bulletproof vest. You're right. There is some weird mirror effect, but better than that. Whenever there's an altruistic thing, the givers do better than the receivers. For instance, there's a study of depression. A scientist who was also a priest, he was a psychologist and priest, wanted to see if praying for people with depression would help them. Because, most prayer is for physical, not mental illness. And so he got a group of 400 people with depression, diagnosed with clinical depression. And he divided them in two groups and had the one half be the senders, the prayers, and the other ones being the prayed for. And he measured what had happened to them afterward very scientifically, and he found that the people being prayed for did well, but the people doing the praying did even better. They were far less depressed. And if you look at all the science of altruism, totally the same. People who give whatever they give, if there's some sort of giving in any capacity, they live longer, they're healthier. If they have a condition and they're helping someone else with the condition, they do better than the recipient. So what turns it all on its head for me, and turns the whole idea of intention on its head, is something I was thinking about when I was watching all of this, because in my little Power of 8 groups, the senders do as well as the receivers. I'll give you an example of this. It's a guy called Wes. He was a Vietnam vet. He was supposed to go to college and get a science degree. He had a whole life plan, and it got derailed because he got a low lottery number for the Vietnam War, and that meant you go off to war. So he was part of that last year. And it was totally traumatic for him. He was very depressed by it. And his life kind of continued down in a lower, in an ever lowering spiral from there. Even he found the love of his life in the late 90s, and she lived for a few years, and then she died of cancer. And he had enormous bills, had to sell his house just to pay the bills back. It was shocking and awful. And he was part of a little Power of 8 group that I assembled about 2 months ago. And he was a sender. He was not even a receiver. And he said he had this almost epiphany of rejuvenation, like, suddenly the grass was smelling, or looking greener, and the flowers were smelling sweeter. And he had got to the point in his life of kind of, what's the use? He's in his mid-60s. Life had been so crap for him. And suddenly he had all this kind of rejuvenation to get back and do things and all kinds of things. And that has happened over and over and over again. The people doing the sending, they have physical healings, they have mental healings, they have some sort of rejuvenation like this, where life makes sense, has purpose, they find their life's purpose. So I have thought a lot about this and about some of the dangerous elements of the self-help movement, because it's all that focus on the self.
Yeah.
That could totally toxic. Yeah, I mean, we've been told from it's like on a Hallmark card, we've been told, do unto others. And I just amend that now. It's think unto others. And, you yourself get healed.
So powerful. About 7 years ago, I think, you came across a statistic that completely blew you away. I think 3/4 of all the medical studies published, and these were studies published about the safety and effectiveness of various pharmaceutical drugs. 3/4 of those studies were in fact written by PR agencies. What on earth?
WTF, as
Yeah.
my 20-year-old says. Yep. And it's not just me. It's, medical journals like the British Medical Journal and the New England Medical Journal and the British, and the JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, all admitting that most of the stuff is massaged, if not made up. I mean, everybody now knows that there is that medical literature is dirty. It's totally dirty. There are organizations that are paid to do the following. They get statistics and information from studies from a drug company. The drug company asks them, put somebody important's name on it. So they contact some doctor in the field who agrees, even though he hasn't actually done the study, to put his name on it, make it more prestigious. And then the PR company's job is to massage the data as much as they can to make unfavorable stuff disappear and make favorable stuff suddenly take over. And so this stuff is really doctored, very doctored, and it's dirty. It's totally dirty. And people, everybody in the medical profession knows this, and yet they're allowed to get away with it. It shocks me deeply. There's a guy called Peter Gosch, who is the head of the Danish Cochrane collaboration. That was an organization set up essentially to look at medical studies and say, let's look at what's actually evidence-based, what's really proven. And Gosch came out with a book called Deadly Medicine and Organized Crime. Now, this guy is a medical insider, right? He's a medical insider, and his book is saying that the drug industry uses every trick that the mafia uses. I mean, and that is somebody who has done medical and drug studies himself, who's the head of a medical body, who's a doctor saying this. And increasingly doctors are. But it's, of course, it's all about the sales. It's all about getting to the audience and making them take drugs, like direct-to-consumer advertising in America, which took a new low when they started doing advertising to 13-year-olds about taking direct to 13-year-old ads about the HPV vaccine, the so-called cervical cancer vaccine, saying it was cool to have this vaccine. They were showing cool, hip young girls on skateboards and saying, hey, I want to be one less who gets cervical cancer. Now that is shocking and disgusting and should be outlawed. And I'm just, I've been running with my husband a magazine called What Doctors Don't Tell You. And we are now all over the place, including the US, the UK, and we have 16 countries now. And I am still outraged. I've been doing this publication in one form or another for 27 years. And every month, he and I are totally outraged by what goes on in the medical profession and the kind of products that are allowed to be released to the public and the amount of harm that it does. So, yeah, it is an understatement.
Because there's so much noise out there, and I guess one of the tactics is just the more confusion, the better. Because if there's so much confusion, it's like, okay, we just don't know what to do. Like, how can we find the good stuff out there? How can we avoid all the noise?
Well, I mean, my byproduct has always been evidence.
Sure.
As I say, that I'm a journalist, and so I believe in evidence. And what we do in the magazine is we write about the evidence about the dangers of some of these products, these drugs, and better alternatives. I have a challenge I always throw out to people. Since I have started this magazine, I say to people, okay, name me one drug besides antibiotics that actually can cure you. One drug. And if you know that drug, it might be, I don't even think they've got a drug for cold sores that actually cures it. It might eliminate the cold sore. It's not going to cure you. Antibiotics are the only thing, and they are fast becoming ineffective because of superbugs. But the only drug I think out there that actually cures and doesn't just suppress is antibiotics. If you can find another one, call me up right away and tell me.
You're kidding. I had no idea. Everything else is just a suppression thing.
Suppress, manages the symptoms, takes away pain, but doesn't cure the problem. Doesn't cure the problem. Absolutely. You can say maybe in a very, very, very limited way, some chemotherapy can eliminate. There's a very, very tiny percentage of it that actually eliminates and cures the situation. That's about it. That's about it. So if you can think of another one, let me know. So with that kind of track record, what we look for all the time is the evidence for alternatives. And there's huge amounts, everything from supplements and diet to many alternative practices have much, much better track record, proven track record, demonstrated through studies or just enormous anecdotal evidence to show that these work better. So that's what we do. That's what we try to do.
One thing I heard, this was years ago. I mean, it might be like 10 years ago. So if things have moved on since then forgive me. But I heard you once speak about thought field therapy. And what is that? And how is that used in Kosovo? Because that was quite interesting.
Yeah, well, thought field therapy is also, there's an do-it-yourself version called emotional freedom techniques. Both emotional freedom technique, and both are essentially ones that seem like they shouldn't work at all. It's basically tapping. You tap on certain acupuncture points while you're holding certain thoughts or saying certain statements, and they are extraordinarily effective. Now, they're kind of based on the idea of a thing called EMDR, which has a lot of evidence that it works, which is you follow somebody's finger while you're talking through a traumatic event. And there's something about that, doing two things at the same time, that helps to erase the pain and trauma of that event. It won't kill the memory altogether, but it kills the pain and the trauma. And the same thing, thought field therapy has been tested out scientifically to help with trauma victims in all kinds of horrible genocide situations, like Kosovo and Rwanda and all kinds of places like that, and have shown an unbelievable success rate. Same thing with EFT, emotional freedom techniques. They're getting tested and studied, and there's a fantastic growing amount of evidence demonstrating the effectiveness of this stuff. Now compare that to a drug for depression or trauma or a talking cure, and there's just no comparison.
I love how it's often the sort of the simple things which is so much more powerful. Like I sound like a broken record, but so much comes back to the idea of connection, feeling connected, feeling a part of something, feeling like you love someone loves you. That is almost it's a remedy for so much. Just simple, like feeling connected to people. That's huge. Just that one thing, and there's so many amazingly other things like that which are so simple. But the simple things often we overlook them, I guess.
Well, and I think we overlook them because we don't understand who we are and how we work. We have this very reductive view, and that's our big problem. We think we have to just sort it through, that we're a machine, and the machine gets bashed with a wrench or gets some oil put in, and it should be all better. And that's our kind of model of drugs and surgery. But what things like EFT are showing is that we are actually an energy field. And that if how else can this work if you aren't doing something energetic to yourself to completely erase a traumatic situation, the pain of a traumatic situation in an instant? What I have found in my little groups, the Power of 8 groups, why should that work so well? And, we study this. Again, the journalist in me wanted to know why these are working. So I actually put people in groups. I got assembled about 250 people, gave them a 7-week course in how to do this, and then assembled them in groups to meet week by week over a year. And this is what I do now with Power. I do these master classes that last a year. But I studied them every month over an entire year. And I found that of the people meeting regularly, pretty much 100% of them had major life transformations. That was about 150 who continued to meet in their groups week by week by week. And by transformations, I mean Patty got over, first of all, she erased breast lumps, and she got over 15-year chronic depression, chronic fatigue. Mitchell had lifelong depression. As a clinical psychologist, you can imagine how depressing that was. And he managed to get over that. We had another woman who repigmented from vitiligo, but we also had people eliminating or rebooting their relationships and creating connections when they had estrangements, serious estrangements, or finding their dream jobs, or having amazing windfalls, or completely changing their life's purpose, or whatever. But 100%. Now, the journalist in me also goes, so what are the odds against chance of 100% of people having these major changes, getting what they asked for? And, you know, I have to say that the chances of that happening are sort of a gazillion to one. But when you talk to them about what did the group intention experience mean for them, and their answers were things like this: the idea that somebody, a group of strangers essentially, because these people met virtually. They met on Skype. They never met, but they are their dearest family now. And they said, amazing that a group of what were strangers have got my back, you know, that intend for my highest good week after week. Or the group intention felt like a soup that changed my brain. That's what one woman, how she put it. Another woman just felt like, I'm part of this bigger constellation. I always see us as coming together as this one unit. And what we have to really understand is we were meant to be a bigger whole. And when we do that, and also when we act for the highest good for other people, and that I've monitored a lot too. When people got off of themselves and started intending for someone else, they might have been stuck before. I had a bunch of them where nothing was happening, intending in the group for themselves. I just finally said, oh, get off of yourself. Don't do that anymore. Intend for someone else. And suddenly, amazing things happened to them. Dream job. Another woman who had been stuck trying to write a book, couldn't write a book, wasn't having any success with editors, gets off of herself, and suddenly, out of nowhere, she has a chance meeting with someone who turns out to be a book coach, who coaches her through, and a former publisher coaches her through the whole thing. She ends up with an Amazon bestseller. You know, it's just on and on and on and on. And we actually did a brain research study to look at what happens with these groups. Why Life University, the largest chiropractic university, offered me their psychology department to do a series of studies. And the first one's been done already. We looked at the brainwave activity of the senders, not the receivers. And we found that there was this kind of global quieting of the brain, of the parietal lobes that make us feel separate. Like this is where we end and the rest of the universe begins. Or the executive functions of the brain, the frontal lobes. And they're very much involved in, again, separation, sense of me, not me, but also doubt, worry, all those negative things. All of that stuff was turned way down. Those brain waves indicate, and they were a signature almost identical to the work of Andrew Newberg, who's done a lot of brainwave studies of Sufi masters and Buddhist monks in ecstatic prayer. But what was so interesting about our situation is that they weren't looking at people who required years of disciplined practice or people who needed hours of priming to get into that state. These were people who were total novices, who'd had a 15-minute video from me explaining how to do this. And they were and all they needed was a group. And they had some sort of fast track to an ecstatic state of mind.
What does a fulfilled life mean to you?
I think it is following, first of all, having connection. For me, the most important thing is my husband and partner for some 30 years and our two grown-up daughters, number one. Number two is having a fulfilling work that for me, is something, it has to be something that tries to make a difference, that tries to give people hope. I think hope is the most important thing there is, to be honest. And my work is, if I try to characterize all the different things I've tried to do, I suppose it's all about giving people hope. Um, um, and living the good life in terms of, not the good life in terms of money, but the good life in terms of health and uh, and eating well, et cetera, et cetera. So I think those kind of things, and as I say, community, having a solid network of friends, and those, to me, those pillars are really, really essential.
What is one thing our listeners can start doing today that will have a positive effect on their lives?
Get 7 of your friends together or connect virtually with a group and create a group, a Power of 8 group, and start intending for each other and watch the transformations. Imagine you're holding hands and you're connected. Just hold the same intention statement for one of the members of the group or somebody outside and see what happens.
Awesome. How can people find out more about you and your work?
They can come to lynnmctaggart.com. That's my website. It has all my information. And check out my new book, The Power of 8.